Okay, welcome to Module 6, and I will be doing both Central and East Asia in this. So this is in combined 6A and 6B. What we're going to be doing today is, in a sense, looking at these two regions, Central and East Asia, together and then pulling them apart and looking at the differences. Okay, again, Module 6, we will be discussing both Central and East Asia. In this packet, we'll be talking about the physical, and the cultural, and the geopolitical landscape of Central and East Asia. Again, defining the regions are very important. I want to contrast the ways that we understand both the regions. First of all, beginning with Central Asia. Key concepts: it is a landlocked region. It exists in terms of a number of states to the far west, Azerbaijan, then Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Afghanistan. And then Mongolia, what is known as New Mongolia, or the Mongolian Autonomous Territories in China, and the Xinjiang Autonomous Territories in China as well. Now, what makes that interesting is that in terms of Central Asia, we see kind of the frontier region of China overlapping into the region. Another way of defining the region is to understand it in terms of its history as the Silk Road route. Today, contemporary aspects of defining it might look at it from an oil and natural gas development area. And then finally, we often think of it as having its western edge at the Caspian Sea. Another point, though, that I do want to say in terms of defining the region, if you take the names of the major states and you say Cossacks and Turkmen and Uzbeks and Kyrgyz and Tajiks and Afghans and Mongols, each of these are ethnic groups, in fact, that exist today. If we went farther into Xinjiang, we would also add to that Hui populations and Uyghur populations. So it's an area of incredibly diverse ethnic makeup. In contrast, when we look at East Asia, it's a fairly straightforward region to define, fairly narrow in terms of its states: China, Japan, South and North Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and the island state of Taiwan. Now, historically, this is a very unified region. There are important cultural aspects that pull the entire region together in terms of language or origins, writing systems, etc., as well as religious and philosophical underpinnings. But today it's an area that's incredibly divided politically in terms of the political ideologies of mainland China versus those of Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and then the kind of unusual characteristics of North Korea. So again, looking at them physically, what I want to point out in terms of the two maps I'm going to show you now is that overlap region that we see in far western China, where eastern China and Central Asia kind of mix together. So again, when we talk about East Asia, Central Asia, we see that the boundary between them is somewhat vague in terms of those states. Again, compare this map to this, and you'll notice that overlap in terms of far western China. Now, I do want to point out, when we talk about Central Asia, the easy way to understand it is in terms of its climate. This is the area central to the Eurasian landmass that is semi-desert and desert. In the north, what we would consider steppe climates, that is a arid grassland, cool climate grasslands, fairly small amounts of precipitation. Then as we move into the basin regions in Central Asia, these are incredibly dry deserts: the Turfan Basin, the Taklam Desert, parts of the Gobi, all exist in terms of very, very dry climates. And then these highland or erogenous mountain belts that divide each one of these basins in terms of the Tibetan Plateau into the Tian Shan, the Kunlun, all of these mountain belts that divide the area. When we look at Central Asia, the other point I want to make is I just want to give you an idea of what we're talking about. What you see in this picture, these are slides from my research there. I do research in the far western areas of China. And in the center of the slide are the large dunes of the Tarim Basin and into the Turfan Basin. And then in the upper corner, what you see is the short grass steppes of this far west region, where the grasses and sedges grow maybe 4 or 5 inches off the ground. What you also see there is one of my colleagues who is actually East China, from Eastern China, and what you'll notice is their garb there is most women in China are not big fans of the sun, and so that's what a field outfit looks like even in the summer. Now, I also want to point out population in terms of the physical context, and what you're looking at here is the far western portion. This is the Tarim Basin, the Taklam Desert. And what you'll notice is this stretch of each one of the little red dots is population. And those population points represent, in fact, the historical trends of the Silk Road. These are areas, small settlements along the margin between the Kunlun in the south, very, very high mountains, the Tarim Basin, which is a low desert, and right on the edge, on that margin, is where population settled because there was enough grass for grazing, enough water for human populations, and it was a relatively easy path to get from East Asia into Central and Eastern Europe. So that represents kind of an edge of the Silk Road. From a physical standpoint, East Asia is fairly easy to define and in fact quite easy to understand because it is effectively the same latitude and extent as North America. So if we think about China, and we'll even add into this the Korean Peninsula, what we can say is that the northernmost tip is about as far as central Quebec. So it's southern Canada in terms of its northern extent, and about as far south as Mexico City at its south. So east to west, it's about the same size, a little bit smaller than the United States, and we can kind of conceive of it as having an east coast very much like the United States in terms of its extent. And the only difference is that it really doesn't obviously have a west coast, but it does have the same transition from eastern humid climates towards a fairly arid interior. An important distinction is on the eastern margin. Unlike in the western margin of the United States, the eastern margin is in fact it's volcanically and tectonically active. The eastern margin, especially the Japanese archipelago running down into Taiwan, is tectonically active, and what we understand as today we call it the Ring of Fire or this crustal margin. And in fact, the reality is that this crustal margin produces the physical geography of Japan, which is volcanic, fairly alpine, or at least high relief. And unfortunately, as we have seen recently, also marine tectonically active, which can produce tsunamis and island earthquakes. And so when we talk about Japan and Taiwan, we have to understand that tectonic scenario that is part of their physical landscape. Again, when we talk about East Asia, major aspects of East Asia, again, what I want you to think about is really in terms of how North America's climate is, North America's landscape. It's not really that different. One of the important distinctions that sometimes comes up is the idea that we often divide the physical geography, and in fact the cultural and historical geography of East Asia in terms of what we call a noodle rice divide. And really all that means is that in the southeast of China into Taiwan and in fact parts of Japan, the southern portions are much more rice producing regions, more humid, warmer climates, and then in the north and in the west is wheat producing areas, cooler climates, somewhat more arid. And so the wheat production goes into, from a cuisine standpoint, much more noodle production. In the south, much more paddy rice production. And so it's kind of one of those quick and easy divides in terms of climate and landscape. In terms of population, very important distinction between the two regions. If you look at Central Asia, what you will notice very, very clearly is that the population is concentrated, again, along the margins of its topography. And again, generally speaking, fairly sparsely populated. Azerbaijan, fairly well populated. But then if you kind of follow what you see here in terms of the population density is really a path from East Asia to Eastern Europe and the European frontiers, population representing to some degree trade routes and very, very long-standing trade routes, but relatively sparse population. In contrast, when we look at East Asia, it's very easy to characterize its population. The farther east you go, the more densely populated the region is. The farther west you go, the less densely populated you see it. And in fact, what you can actually see in this slide, if you'll notice in the west, is this tail going off in this direction, and that is in fact, again, the remnants of the Silk Road and its population. Now, if we look at the region then more broadly in terms of what's happening to its population, what we can see are some interesting characteristics. There are regions in the area, especially Afghanistan being the most notable, where it remains very, very rapid population growth, high rates of total fertility, and in fact relatively low life expectancies. If we move into areas such as Azerbaijan, in contrast, the more the state develops, the more the population is becoming stable. And again, you'll notice here, Azerbaijan certainly does have this kind of bulge or this hip in its reproductive cohort, but its rate of fertility has rather dramatically dropped off as the base becomes more narrow. And so essentially a rather stable population. The same can be seen in East Asia. In fact, the trends are becoming much more significant. China has done, and you'll read about the one-child policies, and has really been quite effective. You'll notice again over time this rather dramatic inversion of the Chinese population pyramid. Japan even more dramatic. Notice how quickly it's dropped off. And in fact, Japan's population is right now is measured as declining. It's actually shrinking in terms of its numbers. Now, what this means, though, is that in the areas of stable or declining population, the challenge is how to deal with this aging population and supporting them. And what you'll see in this image is in fact an older individual working in Beijing, and his job solely is to polish the cracks between the pieces of stone. And so what we have the challenge of is how do you deal with an aging population, a welfare population? And again, in this region, the environmental challenges are significant.